Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, you enjoyed your first session. I know mine was fantastic that I get to sit in on. My name is Stacey Davis. I'm with the Missouri Department of Conservation here in Kansas City, and welcome to this morning's second session of the day, garden maintenance for wildlife, a new way to garden. Um, as we go through the session, just like if you've been in any of the other sessions, make sure to type in any thoughts, comments, questions into the chat feature. And then at the end of the session, I'll get those to the speaker so we can answer those. And um, anything, if we happen to not be able to get all of them, we'll be able to answer those in the office hours with the speaker later. So now I'd like to welcome Scott Woodbury. Scott's for 30 years led the development of the Whitmire Wildflower Garden at Shaw Nature Reserve and has written, lectured, and consulted on many native landscape projects. Scott teaches native landscape practices at St. Louis Community College and recently launched Cacalia Garden Design and Wilding, a consulting and design business in St. Louis. Scott received a BS degree in horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has worked at various public gardens. He currently serves as advisor to the horticulture program of St. Louis Community College, Grow Native, and Wild Ones St. Louis, a chapter that he founded in 2000 and is now the nation's largest. Awesome. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much, Stacey. It's great to be here. Good to see you all. I can't see you all, but you can see me. I had my fingers and my toes crossed that we'd be able to sit down together at a live conference, and it didn't happen, but that's okay. We're here now, and I look forward to the next time that we can actually see each other face to face. Let me share my screen and get started. All right. A new way to garden maintenance for wildlife, a new way to garden. I've been gardening for 40 years, and I'm amazed at how much I continue to learn every single year. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, gardening didn't really include native plants or native landscaping. There was very little of it going on anyway. We had a different way of doing things. And this talk is about how we can change the way we garden. I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about finding balance between turf and garden. I think of turf and garden, and I think of dark and light. I think of yin and yang. I think of negatives and positives, light and dark. There's always a balance in everything, and I think there's a balance in the garden. And this talk really is about finding balance between lots of different things. The time we have, the money we have to spend, the amount of maintenance we would like to do, the amount of garden that we'd like to take care of, how much pollution we want to put out in the environment, and how much wildlife we want to try to attract to our landscapes. So I think turf is sort of at the center of this concept of a new way to garden. So let's just dive in with a conversation about turf. Doug Tallamy tells us that there's way too much turf. There's more turf than there are national parks. This is a typical house and this is a house in St. Louis. It used to be owned by a friend of mine and a Wild Ones member. And I wanted to start here because as I think about opposites, when I think about yin and yang, when I think about where a garden potentially can go, and sometimes when it goes too far, I think about this garden. This is actually was one of the most vital and diverse and amazing gardens in St. Louis. The homeowner had a goal when he bought the house, and that was to fill it up with native plants, and did a really wonderful job. Another one of his goals was to get rid of the lawnmower because he didn't want to cut grass anymore. And he met this goal. Here's the garden. People came to see it. Wild Ones had tours here all the time. It was always a magical experience to walk into this garden because you feel like you're disappearing into another place. But this is kind of the extreme. This person had lots of time to garden, spent a lot of time outside creating and creating wonderful designs and increasing the species diversity of the plants. And yes, of course, the wildlife diversity came as well. But then, something happened. Something happened in life, and this person had to move and then try to sell this house. And so the sale of the house brought a lot of frustration. First, it didn't bring any buyers, but then eventually it did bring in a new buyer who wanted to change things. And this is the actual after photograph that shows what this new buyer did to this landscape. Talk about opposites, positive, negative. There's so much difference between this landscape as you see it today and the landscape that used to be here. So I think this really has to do with what I want to say, and that is that that there's always a balance between turf and garden, and everybody has a different interest. Everybody has different use of space. Our use of turf in the garden has always been, well, not always, but for the past 14 years, 15 years, has been focused on playing outside, spending time out in the yard, running around, playing ball. And so for us, turf has had a place in the garden. And what I find is that for new gardeners, for beginner gardeners, a really good place to start is small. Start with a landscape that is a new garden that is maybe 200 or 300 square feet to start with. See how that goes. Get a feel for the maintenance that's involved. Smaller gardens like this are relatively easy to care for, low plant diversity, low maintenance. But what I find is that when you have a few plants, you also have a few critters that come to visit it. It's not as robust. The bigger it is, the more plants there are, the more diversity there is, the greater potential there is for attracting wildlife. But you don't want to start too quickly. You want to start small. Lawns are oftentimes thought of as a way of being responsible in the neighborhood, a way of caring for your property and caring for your community. But I think that if you start to think of what is actually going on with turfgrass in terms of human health, in terms of environmental health, you really quickly find out that you're not really doing the community any favors by maintaining lawns with heavy doses of chemicals. Lawn care is, not all lawn care companies are the same. Some of them are really great, and there are a lot of really organic lawn care companies that don't rely on chemicals to maintain lawns. But there are a lot of companies that do this, that end up making contributions to the watershed of fertilizers and pesticides that are irresponsibly introduced into the environment. And so this is pollution at its worst. This is one source of pollution in the Midwest. The Mississippi River Basin reaches out from Idaho all the way to New York State. This is really eye-opening to me. It is a huge watershed, and all of that water and all of those fertilizer inputs and pesticide inputs end up down in the Gulf of Mexico, and it causes huge problems for humans down there. The fishery gets disrupted. The fish actually die. Anything that can't swim away from this hypoxic zone of nutrient-rich water that grows algae basically dies and can't survive. So we have a really big issue here, and we have an opportunity to think or rethink about what a healthy lawn consists of. This is my yard. We've got tons of weeds in the grass. Some of these weeds are fun to experience. When our kid was young, dandelions were always being blown all over the place. We've picked dandelion greens from our yard and have made bitters for making drinks. We picked violet flowers and violet leaves to put in salads because they're high in vitamin C and they're delicious. By the way, we don't spray any chemicals on our yard, and we don't have a dog. So if you have a dog, you need to be careful about picking things out of your lawn for obvious reasons. So to me, this is what a healthy lawn is. This lawn has diversity. If you are going to have a lawn, I hope your lawn can look like this. There's a bee biologist in St. Louis at St. Louis University named Gerardo Camilo, and he did some research with his grad students looking at neighborhood populations of bees. And in parts of St. Louis where weediness was allowed, bee diversity was greater, bee species diversity was far greater, and the numbers were greater. In parts of St. Louis that were very neat and tidy and didn't allow weed growth, bee diversity sank down and was low. And so we know that if you have weeds, you can do something for the environment, even using non-native weeds. I shouldn't say using these weeds, because these weeds just occur all by themselves. I spent the first 25, 30 years of my career gardening with brown mulch. Most of us have gardened with brown mulch. Mulch is something that we think of as being positive, as being organic, as a way of adding organic matter back to the soil, a way of insulating the soil and keeping it moist so plants can thrive better. And this was a really tough one for me to get my head around. And only in recent years have I come to realize that there's some issues with brown mulch. What are the issues with brown mulch? Well, you have to put it down once or twice a year. It's a lot of extra maintenance. There's a lot involved there. And the thing that I realized later was that that there's a lot of wildlife lost. There's a great potential for lots of critters when you stop mulching gardens and start getting used to leaf litter. Why do we care about leaf litter? Because critters like the clearwing moths that we have coming to Monardas in the summertime, Luna moths that are just these incredible moths that you can actually see if you hang a white sheet outdoors at night and shine a light at it. You can find all sorts of different nocturnal critters like moths. Io moths are another one that hang out in leaf litter, and these moths literally look for leaf litter like this, so freshly fallen leaf litter. And so when I think about keeping leaf litter in the garden, this is a picture in the Whitmire Wildflower Garden. I think about how just 10 years ago, I thought that this was something that needed to be raked up, needed to be hauled away to the compost pile. This is really something that shouldn't be happening in a garden. That our garden should be cleaner and neater and tidier and mulched, and that's just the way we garden. What I see now is diversity of leaves and texture. I see seed heads, and in this case, those are the fertile fronds of sensitive fern coming up through leaf litter. I see normalcy. I see something that is the way it's supposed to look. Um, and I also can see the critters that use this habitat. You have to work really hard to find these things, to find these moth cocoons that are tucked into the leaves, sometimes wrapped up with leaves. Um, but if you actually spend some time looking around in the leaf litter, you might find these things. I've seen the cocoons of woolly bears, sometimes in leaf litter that's blown up against the house. If I'm raking the leaves away from the house, I'll see a cocoon in there, little brown fuzzy cocoon. Now this is the actual caterpillar, not the cocoon. You've seen these things in the fall. They're crawling around all over the place. What are they doing? They're looking for leaf litter to pupate into, and so they pupate into this crazy little uh, styrofoam fuzzy thing, and they sit there over winter until spring. And then what do they turn into? I mean, they turn into one of the most beautiful moths that you've ever imagined. So this is a tiger moth caterpillar. Sorry, tiger moth. And so they are really quite a stunning critter, all of which have a total dependence on leaf litter. So I think we need to think a little bit differently about leaf litter. We definitely need to think a little bit differently about fall cleanup. So this is something that was always done in the fall, raking up leaves, cutting down stems, um, making the garden look neat and tidy as we go into winter. But this is another area that I think has been turned upside down for me, and having seed heads standing in winter now for me is something that adds beauty. It adds diversity to what humans see, um, and it also is a way to increase the diversity of the organisms that live on the planet with us. Heather Holm has written a few books, Pollinators of Native Plants, and one or two other books. She was the first person several years ago to introduce to me, like others, this concept of when you do come around to cutting your plant stems down, cut them high, cut them 12, 14 inches high. When you cut them high like this, then you offer opportunities for insects for bees in particular, to nest and lay eggs. Now, I recommend that you do this in the early part of spring or late winter. So usually March is a good time to do this. You see snow on the ground here, and so that's an indicator that it might have been clipped earlier. Leave those seed heads all through winter if you possibly can. Those seed heads are great. They provide great food for birds when there is snow on the ground. There's just very little for them to eat when the snow is covering the ground. So keep those seed heads standing through the end of winter. And then by spring, what you will find, if you look carefully, you don't even have to look very carefully, you'll find bees drilling into those stems. You'll find bees drilling into tiny little stems of Monarda fistulosa. Those are really small stems. If you cut sumac back or any woody plants, bees will drill into the soft pith of sumac and lay eggs down in there. They can lay eggs down as deep as 8 inches, and so that's why we recommend keeping stems 12 inches high, 14 inches high, possibly 10 inches is okay too. Anything that you can leave standing in the spring is really beneficial for our native bees. Does this look unsightly? Does this look like something you don't want to have in your garden? Possibly. It's a new way of gardening. It's a new way of thinking about the garden. I I I found that usually starting in April, the new leaves start coming up and growing around these stems that have been cut back. They hide the brown stems that have been cut back, and then they support those stems through the rest of the season. Because what's happening is bees are drilling into the stems, laying eggs there. The eggs will sit there all summer and all following winter, and then hatch out the next year. So you need to protect those stems. You need to keep those stems in place for another year. And so your green vegetation helps to support them, to keep them standing upright. And so the idea is to leave those stems indefinitely. All right, shifting gears a little bit. How much lawn and garden can you care for? Lawn and garden are a balance. When I think of that balance, I think of the time that it takes to care for a garden. I think of the money that you may need to spend to have the garden cared for. And I think about trying to create as much garden as possible for the wildlife that are going to benefit from it. Everybody has a different capacity for physical labor. Everybody has a different capacity for hiring help. And everybody has a different capacity for encouraging friends and family to come over and help out in the gardening process. So that's a dynamic that each of us are going to have to work out. And again, remember, start small when you're a beginner gardener, and then grow as you get a feel for how much space you can take care of. How much time does it take to care for a garden? It depends on the garden style. Conventional garden styles like you see here do require a little more maintenance. There is mulch between those plants, and that's very conventional looking. There are masses of plants that are repeated along the garden bed. But also there's not as much species diversity in gardens like this. In general, the species diversity is less. And so when I think of these highly designed gardens, things that are very artistic, tend to not have as much plant diversity because there's more reliance on large drifts of plants. So taking advantage of using many plants per grouping. A conventional garden takes more time to maintain than a more naturalistic garden. On average, 4 to 8 minutes per square foot per year. You can do the math and say on a 500 square foot garden, it might take 1 to 2.5 hours per week to take care of a garden like this. This is something that planners need to think about when they are installing gardens, when they're designing the gardens, hopefully when they're designing it, not when they're installing it. Work out these numbers in advance. Because when you create a complex garden, a garden that has a lot of plant diversity and a very stylized design, these gardens grow. And if you want to maintain that design, it takes a lot of time to keep each plant in the right place so it doesn't turn into a total scramble. By contrast, a natural design style, a garden that has a more loose arrangement of plants, has on average, it has more diversity of plants. On average, it takes 2 to 4 minutes per square foot per year to take care of a garden like that. And if you look at a 500 square foot space, it takes about 30 to 50 minutes on average per week to care for a garden like this. Now, it doesn't say 0 minutes per week. You can install a natural garden or a wild looking garden and walk away from it because it will become a weed patch pretty quickly. So all gardens require maintenance. But just to give you an idea of what a natural design style might look like, this is a fairly wild looking garden. There is a lot of diversity in a garden like this. There's no reliance on massing plants, but it's really letting plants spread and move around the garden freely. It does involve gardening. It does involve putting pressure on some of the species that are a little bit too aggressive, and plants that are not very aggressive, helping them along so that they can continue to thrive amongst all of the chaos. Remember, high diversity in a natural design style equals low maintenance or lower maintenance. And that really is the hallmark of a natural garden. Ground covers obviously reduce diversity, and there's not as much wildlife that can take advantage of it, but there may be applications where ground covers are appropriate. We definitely want to remove English ivy. We want to remove winter creeper euonymus. Those are bad invasive species that we're having a lot of trouble with in the environment. And if you want to replace them with some kind of natural or native ground cover, here's a couple ideas. Pennsylvania sedge works very well in a part shade environment. I found that it does require some watering, so you will need to water it kind of like you would water a turf lawn. It does not hold up to foot traffic, so I wouldn't call this a turf alternative. But it is fairly low, and it is something that you can walk through on occasion. Notice those weeds in there. It's not weed free. It does require some maintenance. But what's really great about Pennsylvania sedge and some of the other smaller sedges is that that you can mow them down. And we do it twice a year. We typically do it in the middle of August, when the plants look a little bit tired, and then they are rejuvenated. They come back strong, and they look really great in September and October and November. And then we mow them again in March when they start to grow again. Another plant that can be an excellent alternative for some of these invasive ground covers, golden groundsel, which is it's also called golden ragwort. It's a ground cover that is blooming in the spring and then evergreen the rest of the year. Round foliage, 6 inches tall. Golden groundwort, golden groundsel is the one that grows best in moisture soils. Round leaf groundsel is the species that grows in drier soils. And prairie groundsel, which is Senecio platensis, which is now called Pachyra platensis, is the species that grows in more full sun. I'd love to see Pachyra platensis get into greater production. It's my favorite. It's really one of the best performers of any of the ground covers that we've used. Okay, so I'd like to ask some questions. And these are the kind of questions that you should be asking yourself when you are beginning down that path of developing a garden, whether it's a garden that you're developing for the first time or the 15th garden that you're developing. How much time do you have as an individual homeowner? How much time do you have to devote to gardening? If you are a facility manager, how much time do you have to manage a big garden? If you are maintaining a school, how much time do you have on your hands? If you're maintaining a church, how much volunteer time do you have? That's a really important question as you develop gardens and develop the size of the garden, because it's so critical that you develop a balanced garden, because if you create a garden that's too big and too complex, then it likely is going to fail. It might fail partially, it might fail completely, it might become a burden, it might become an eyesore. And so it's really important, in order to have successful maintenance, to have a garden that's the right size and the right style for your maintenance capacity. How much experience do you have? Knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know is really important. Um, Find help, find experts, professional horticulturists, to help you on your path to developing a garden that is in harmony with nature and in harmony with your capacity to care for it. Um, Look for help. There are lots of new businesses in the Kansas City area and the St. Louis area that are there to answer your questions, to guide you through the process of planting a garden, installing a garden, maintaining a garden. And it's important to know that there are lots of new businesses that are out there that are focusing on native plants and native landscaping. How much help do you have? I think of so many volunteer-based projects, like the Sierra Club Garden here in St. Louis. And these are community gardens. These are gardens that don't have a budget to maintain them. They get free plants from, in this case, from some Wild Ones members that have adopted this garden. They rely on one another to get together and pull weeds and divide plants and install new plants and have fun, by the way. And so how much time do you have? How much help do you have? Help can be really important. It can be really fun and a really healthy way to live your life in your community. Get involved. Obviously, we have to think about how much money we have too, because money has something to do with everything. And I think this is a really great example of a partnership that's happening in St. Louis, where in the South Grand neighborhood, a contractor, Pretty City, is working to maintain these bump out gardens along the street. Some of them are rain gardens, some of them are not. But the city doesn't have the community improvement district doesn't have all the money in the world. None of us have all the money in the world. So what they have is a contract with a company called Eco Landscaping, and Eco Landscaping is basically coordinating volunteers to do maintenance in these gardens. So there's a small amount of money that a contractor is hired to do some of the tasks. Another small amount of money that is going to a volunteer coordinator who comes in and maintains these gardens. So it's there's some really creative ways to make gardens. Remember that a lot of diversity in a natural style can be a lower maintenance option if you don't have a lot of money, or if you don't have a lot of people or time yourself, or the ability to garden. I want to give you some resources to help you on your journey. If you go to the Grow Native website, you will see a number of sample gardens. These are gardens that are full of native plants. They're all small gardens. They're not terribly big. So they're all gardens that really can fit into most people's busy lifestyles. There's a formal garden for sun. There's a formal garden for shade. There's a rain garden. There's a pond garden. There's a design for a mailbox, and there's a couple other gardens in there as well. So these can be a useful place to start if you're frustrated by trying to figure out how to design a garden. It's a good place to go. Go check it out. The Native Landscaping Manual that is at the Shaw Nature Reserve website is a good resource for you as you're trying to learn about which plants to use. Chapter 4, Landscaping with Native Plants, is a great guide because in the back of it, there's several lists of plants. And these lists of plants will help you narrow down your focus, to figure out which plants are going to be best for you. You're not going to have a successful garden if you plant a bunch of things that deer love to eat. And so in the back of chapter 4, which is available online at Shaw Nature Reserve, or you can buy paper copies at the visitor center, you can find the results of a 3-year study that happened near Rockwood Reservation here in St. Louis, which has a huge deer population. There's some plants that deer tend to avoid, and there are a bunch of plants that deer love to eat a lot, and then there's some plants that are somewhere in the middle. Also, I like to think about the plants that are going to perform the very best. Obviously, you will have success with gardening, success with maintenance if you have plants that are successful. So finding top performing plants and using them first is a great way to go. If you look at the top performing plant list that is again on the Shaw Nature Reserve website, if you go to Gardens and Gardening and look for the resources section, you will find the top performing plant list. It's a 2-page plant list that has top performing plants for sun on one side and then plants for shade on the other side. And it gives you lots of information that's really useful as you're deciding how to use plants. Another good resource at the, again, back to Grow Native, Carol David has amassed a number of top 10 lists. And again, these are top performing plants. These are the top plants for the top 10 goldenrods for gardening, the top 10 native evergreen plants for gardening, the top plants with winter interest, the top plants for butterflies and moths. And so there's many lists here, and they're useful guides because, again, it's sort of a concentration of plants that are going to be the most successful for any situation or many situations that exist. I'm going to stop there, say thank you, and welcome any questions that may have come up. I'm also going to stop sharing my screen. And take any questions you may have.
All right. I'm going to start off. Faye was wanting to know if you could restate a resource. You mentioned a book, the one with chapter 4, Planting with Natives.
Yeah, it's called the Native Landscaping Guide. It's a 4-chapter It's a 4-chapter guide that's available at Shaw Nature Reserve's website or the visitor center at Shaw Nature Reserve in St. Louis. They're free PDF downloads that are available on the website. The first chapter is Reconstructing Tallgrass Prairies. So it's a seeding guide. The second chapter is Control and ID of Invasive Plants. The third chapter is Rain Gardening. Fourth chapter is a general gardening guide using native plants in general.
Very cool. All right. And Carolyn is asking, did you say that with more plant diversity in a garden, you'd have less maintenance?
Well, it depends on the style of the garden. So if you have a really big conventional style garden with lots of different kinds of plants in it, the diversity, the maintenance can still be pretty high. If you choose a design style that is very loose and natural and like a tossed salad, where plants are more likely to spread from seed or move around freely, you will have the ability for greater diversity of plants, and definitely will have reduced maintenance because there will be so many plants covering the ground, filling up spaces, that there won't be as many opportunities for weeds to come up in those kinds of gardens.
Awesome. And actually, I have one for myself. I started writing a note earlier, and I don't know, I got distracted. I didn't finish it. You were talking about the Pennsylvania sedge, that you cut it down in mid-August, and what was the other time of year that you would mow it down?
Um, at the end of winter, so February or March would
Okay.
be the second time to mow it.
Yeah.
And it really is a plant that performs best when you water it. I've seen it under automatic sprinklers, and it does great there. We just water it in the garden as needed through the summer months when it gets dry. The drier it gets, the more open it grows, and the more it allows other plants to grow in it. So that means weeds, or possibly you can get creative and plant other things in it, like possibly prairie pussy toes, or possibly fall onions, or you can get creative and add other small plants to Pennsylvania sedge, and create possibly some interesting layered ground cover planting.
Your example of the gentleman you knew who had the really complex kind of wild yard, and then that drastic change when the new homeowners came on. It's always I think a fear for people who do have the natives is, oh, it's near and dear to your heart. It's like, you have to sell your house, you have to move on, but it's kind of like, oh, that hurts to see something, even if it's not quite as drastic as that one was.
Yeah, you definitely want to create something that that is going to have longevity.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Got another question here. How do you use an automatic sprinkler when you also have a specified garden bed in the turf with native plants? Don't want to overwater.
So how do you water a garden that has turf around it? Kind of.
Or actually, it sounds like the sprinkler might be like designed to water the garden bed, but how do you maybe set that timing wise? I guess maybe. Carolyn, I don't know if you can maybe give a little more detail there.
So there are oftentimes problems with irrigation systems. Putting too much water out is not a good thing. Letting plants go completely dormant when you have a severe drought is not necessarily a good thing. It's nice to have plants that are growing and thriving. And so I'm not an irrigation expert, but I know that drip irrigation is a good way to go. Consider using drip irrigation as opposed to sprinklers that spray water out and hit plants. It's kind of hard. It's tricky to sort of get the water where you need it to go. And so you need an irrigation expert to sort of help you if you have an irrigation system. An irrigation system that doesn't work very well is a pain in the neck. And I know that they're expensive too. And so you might consider using hoses and putting your own sprinklers out by hand. That if you have a small scale garden, it possibly can work for you.
Yeah, and Carolyn did give a little more explanation. So they just started a garden within the turf. So the sprinkler was originally designed for the turf, and then now they've put a garden in. I would say maybe too, if there's a way to tweak which direction the sprinkler's going, to maybe have it not be focused as much on the garden.
Yeah, you can also buy new sprinkler heads, have them installed that direct the water where you need it to go.
Yeah. All right. April's wanting to know your personal top 10 plants for beginners for low maintenance.
Well, all of those most of those top 10 lists were written by me. So if you go to the top 10 lists at the Grow Native website, you will see my personal top picks for all of those different situations. My top 10 picks for gardening in shade, my top 10 rain gardening picks, my top 10, you name it. It's there. Those are my top picks. And so that's an easier way of answering that question than going back and telling you.
Very good.
I will say that that my favorite native plants change all the time. It changes through the seasons. But I decided to name my company Cacalia because it's one of my favorite plants. It's a plant that is native to Missouri. There are 4 or 5 different species of it. It's underutilized in the garden, and it's just a stunning tall plant that grows in shade mostly, but textural and not overly showy, and something worth growing in the garden.
Nice. I like this. Faye had to thank you. She was like, she'd already said she'd already logged on to the Shaw Nature Reserve. She hadn't realized it was part of the Missouri Botanical Garden, MOBOT. I think I may have spelled that wrong. Anyway, she's from Philly, so she's hoping to get to St. Louis to see the gardens there soon. Sydney is asking if you could talk more about the equation for how long it takes to maintain gardens.
Sure. So if you look at those tables that I showed you, you'll notice that it's a maintenance, how many minutes per square foot per year. And the calculation is not based on 12 months of labor per year, but it's based on 8 months of labor per year, because we're basically not intensely gardening in the winter months. And so, yeah, those calculations are based on 8 months of labor. They're also based on long-term maintenance after establishment. So I'm not talking about that period when, for the first 2 or 3 years when you're getting a garden established, which oftentimes has a different amount of maintenance, usually has more maintenance involved. But I'm talking about after establishment, when plants are fully mature. Yeah, those are some of the ideas behind those numbers. And obviously, when I talk to my colleagues about these numbers, I get feedback all the time. And one thing that I have heard is that gardens that are in shade generally have lower numbers or lower, smaller amounts of maintenance required than plants that are growing in full sun or gardens that are in full sun. And so keep that in mind. You may realize that the numbers aren't really making sense for you if you're gardening in the shade.
Makes sense. And Stan wants to get your kind of your input on plugs versus plants.
Plugs versus
maybe bigger plants, maybe
container, like, so yeah, plugs. I think plugs are great. I think that we rely too much on that initial impact of what a garden looks like when you first put it in. There's a lot of interest in putting ginormous plants in the ground because they're very impressive right from the start. But if you think about it, if you put a plug in the ground, it is going to, in a very short period of time, usually during the first growing season, it'll grow bigger. It'll be big by the end of the season. So I'm a big fan of using plugs. I think that it really comes down to what your budget is. A plug itself might cost $2.50 just for the plug itself, and it might cost $6 to $8 to plant it if you're a contractor putting it in the ground. Now compare that to a gallon perennial that might cost $8 to $12 and might cost $25 to $30 to plant a single gallon pot. there's quite a big difference in cost.
Yeah, definitely. And you did talk about the resources for kind of plants that deer don't like. Does the Grow Native site, I believe it does also have resources for plants that rabbits tend to not like as much? Am I correct on
Oh,
that one?
I don't know.
Or just
I
everything?
no, I know that I know rabbits are tricky, and so Stacy, we talked earlier about woodchucks, and they seem to be nibbling indiscriminately.
Yeah.
They love to nibble on things that are newly planted. This seems to be like a target that they can hone in on, thinking that it's just there for them. Sometimes there might be some scent, some sort of human scent that's associated with the plant when you put it in the ground freshly, and somehow maybe animals can smell that. I'm not sure. I just know that newly planted gardens are vulnerable, and so it is really a good idea to find a way to protect them. Maybe put something up around the garden. We're planting a big garden in St. Louis, and we're going to be putting a deer fence up around it, which consists of um, tall pieces of rebar and heavy duty fishing line tied between them. And that seems to work pretty well to discourage deer. Rabbits, you might need to use chicken wire for a while, which is noticeable.
But
Or maybe there's some other kinds of fencing materials that you can put up temporarily to keep the rabbits out. I know it's discouraging sometimes.
all right. Let's see. Caitlin's asking, is there a time when leaving the leaves is such a thick pile that it's suffocating shade or partial shade plants?
Yeah, so I'm not recommending that you rake up leaves into piles and leave them out in the yard, um, because then they can be too thick, and they can keep plants from coming up effectively in the spring. So what I'm proposing is allowing the leaves to fall in place, and maybe there's some places where you can allow that to happen, and maybe there are parts of your garden where you do need to rake them up and rely on mulch ground cover or mulches, brown mulches. After all, we are trying to be successful in our communities. We're trying to reach people where they are. Everybody's in a different place, and some people are in a garden that's fully mulched with brown mulch, and so maybe there is an opportunity for 10 or 20% of that garden to be in naturally fallen leaves. Maybe not 100%. Maybe that number can change as your perception of the garden changes, like it has with me. Keep in mind that you can always move leaves off the lawn and into garden beds, but do it right away. Do it right when the leaves fall to the ground, because that's when critters, especially these moth species, are going to be looking for a home for winter. Don't wait until December to rake those leaves and then move them around, because the critters will have already pupated into cocoons by then.
Um, Cindy's asking if you've noticed oak trees inhibiting the growth of some shade plants like ferns.
Sure. Oak trees generally are fairly forgiving trees as trees go. Maples and hackberries are tough because they've got really shallow, fibrous roots that do compete with plants like ferns and celandine poppy and you name it. Oaks generally are a little bit more forgiving. I would guess that your oak trees have some lower limbs that you potentially could cut off. And so high shade is when you remove the branches on the trunk going up on a mature tree, maybe 20, 25 feet. And so what happens is it allows reflective light to move into the garden sort of indirectly from the sides. And that is a good way to get sunlight to your plants. I've got a kitty here that's
Yes.
saying, yes, that's exactly what you need to do. Um, So limbing up trees is important. Sunlight may be more of your problem than the roots, especially when it comes to an oak tree.
Gotcha. It's a little bit too deep a shade there. Okay. Well, I think that's the last question that we have on the chat. So thank you, everybody, for all the good questions that you had. Scott does have office hours right after this, so just hop off and hop on there if you want to ask your questions to him personally there. I'd love to have the company during his office hours. Also, don't forget to do your session evaluation. And then at, let's see, at 11 o'clock is our final presentation for the day. So thank you, Scott, for your time. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Come back and we'll have more of a discussion in a few minutes.